Hey everyone, welcome to episode 9. My name is Sam, and I'm here with Jonathan. And before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment so you can stay up to date on everything Truvle, including our weekly topics and discussions. Jonathan, why don't you kick us off today?
Thanks, Sam. So today we'll be under the heading of advice for a person at any level within an organization that's faced with some major change that's upcoming that they don't know how they personally will be impacted. So your company is going to be merging with another company. You just hear the announcement, or it's going to be acquired. And we wanted to give some advice on how you should approach that.
And it's interesting because you don't hear a lot of advice given to the people who are sort of anxious about the change. You oftentimes, it's now in the corporate space, when you talk about change management and that whole discipline, and you talk about how do you basically manage change in people. So how do you force people to change essentially without so much friction, which is always kind of talking about managing it. But this topic is really more about, if you're the one who's heard about a change and it's making you anxious, how would we advise you process that? Because this happens a lot in business. It happens a lot whether you hear about a new big, huge project is announced that's going to impact your group, or like Jonathan said, it could just be, hey, the whole organization is going through a shift. But it always creates a resistance is first. And the one thing I'd say to start the conversation is it's okay to feel resistant to change. That's one thing I want to say. And everyone talks about how to combat that, like it's a bad thing. But let's talk about it being a human thing, which is that we know that you are going to be the one hearing this. You're going to naturally start to resist as soon as you hear a big change is coming, especially if you don't know what the change is or you don't know how it's going to impact you. And the first thing I'd say is that's okay. But then how do you go from there? And that's when you talk about lots of things like, all right, how do we be more present? How do I actually do my job day to day? How do I actually support the change? Even though I could be resistant, how am I be a supporter and not a detractor? How do I manage my emotions versus the different things that are going on in the work environment, whether they're going to impact me positively or impact me negatively? So there's a lot of different things there. And I guess I didn't really start with advice. I was kind of just teeing up more the topic of
No,
conversation.
I think you gave a critical piece of advice. It goes back to the awareness that we once that was mentioned on another one. Be aware and be compassionate to yourself about the feelings and what you're processing. I think for me, I know that most of the best days that I've ever had in my life weren't planned. And most of the worst days or worst outcomes that I thought were going to happen didn't come to pass. And so you start reflecting on all the time spent worrying about whatever change is coming up and bringing into it, all your worst fears about how it'll impact you. And that whole mindset makes you lose all that period of time, from the time that you heard there was going to be a change again till the period of time when life goes back to normal, whatever that means in your head. So being aware that you could be losing all of that time, and since most of life is spent between events or between big things that are upcoming, or imagining them, the question is how to be present or mindful, which is something that is always the case. You always want to be that way. I think when there's big change coming up, it just exacerbates the natural tendency to imagine the worst outcomes, or otherwise start investing tremendous meaning into every little thing that happens in your day in some attempt to try and control what's going to control the world around you by understanding, this means it's going to be bad. Because even sometimes if you imagine the worst outcome, that outcome in some ways controlling, it gives you some sense of control, because now I know it's going to be bad and that's my life, as opposed to just being comfortable with not knowing what's going to happen, being comfortable with being vulnerable, as Sam was saying, and having the opportunity to enjoy that period of time. And we'll talk in a second also about how you can actually help yourself at work by being more present. So
Generally, yeah, the advice on, and this is just, let's put change aside for a second. I think a very important topic that Jonathan just summarized, which is the more you're in your head thinking about implications or futures that haven't arrived yet, the less you're doing work in the moment, the less that you're being productive, the less that you're engaged with something and creating something right now. And that's a practical dimension of presence. So if you're into the mindfulness space at all, you know that being present is a big milestone, but I often think there's a dearth of practical application discussed about it. And one of those is what we're talking about, which is being present is really just the idea that you can continue to focus on productive activity, doing, creating in the moment, and not being preoccupied with thinking about things that you can't control or haven't come to pass, because that's just an inefficient use of your time. So to Jonathan's point of, if there's a major change announced, it's best practice typically to announce major changes coming so there's transparency and people aren't surprised, but it also does create this anxious state where you feel like something's going to happen to you and you don't have all the details, and you can let yourself get preoccupied. So I think the practical summation is business as usual is actually going to benefit you emotionally and mental health wise by just saying, okay, I know this is coming, I appreciate getting a heads up, but I can't serve myself or the company by excessively worrying about it at the detriment of distracting me from producing things and doing my day-to-day job. So that's a hard balance, but it's the one that if you want to manage it, it's actually one you have to strike, because no amount of thinking about it, unless you're directly engaged in planning or executing, is going to help you manage it when it comes. I think that's something. It's that ceding of control that actually counterintuitively gives you a better sense of balance, I suppose.
And a practical example of how it plays out is you could imagine that maybe someone senior to you or someone who may be part of, who might be more in the know of how things are going to play out, is avoiding you. Let's say that they missed a meeting that you normally have, and it creates a whole drama in your head. And if you were more present, you might realize that, oh, maybe my boss is going to be affected by this change. And he or she is very concerned about how this is going to play out and is equally distracted. So being more present gives you a lot more opportunity to see the whole situation for what it possibly is. And again, all of our themes constantly relate to one another. So when we talk about adding value or being part of the value that the company is trying to deliver to the market, it's the same thing here. In a scenario where there's going to be a lot of change, a lot of people's hair is on fire, a lot of people are nervous. But when you're present and you see how maybe you could start to see how maybe you can add value in the scenario, or how other people are being affected, and maybe you can be helping them and help them process what the change might be. And otherwise, just simply being more present and less in your head gives you a lot more opportunity for how you potentially could succeed in a scenario.
Yeah, and business, it's all about navigating the transition states, and we've talked about that before too. And it's funny to think about navigating transition state by, in a way, just being more present. It's kind of counterintuitive, because I think you're hearing us say, to some extent, we're changing, we're always in a state of transitioning, and we can even talk about how this is going to be a permanent state of life as we move forward. Changes are happening more frequently, and they're happening more frequently and they're happening faster. I guess those go hand in hand, but they're technically two separate dimensions. But in order to actually navigate them more fluidly, you have to be malleable, and you have to tend to constantly what you have to be doing at that moment. If you're constantly 2 steps ahead in your mind of where you need to be going, then you're never really where you are right now. So it's going to be hard to produce and be changing at the same time if you're overly focused on one or another. It really, what we're talking about is a call to the new normal. And again, I know that's usually associated with the pandemic, but I'm really talking about the new normal of perpetual change, because the idea that you're resistant to change is sort of relative to your current state of stability or normalcy. And these are all just constructs in our minds. Jonathan, you look like you wanted to.
Well, I would say that there is, we might say that this is the new normal, but I think that it's an illusion all the time when people think that they know what's going to come next. So whether or not there's some major announcement of change, to think that you know exactly what your life will be like 6 months from now is silly, because there is a lot of change that occurs all the time. And it's just a vain attempt for people to try and get ground beneath their feet and assert some sort of control around of their world, or think that they are, that makes it that's always a challenge. I think generally a good idea for businesses in a scenario where there's a lot of change would be to have mindfulness practices. Most businesses do these days. There's some yoga or meditation time. I think that's a fairly common practice, and I think it's a smart one because this is people are iterating toward wanting to be more present in their life and not have all the stress and anxiety that comes from just spending all your time in your head.
And the trend of mindfulness practice in business, I agree with Jonathan. It's increasing. I think it's a good idea, but I've also seen it implemented shallowly and not have the results that we're talking about. So, here Jonathan and I are having a conversation about sort of the mechanics, and even from our professional perspective, how you navigate change better, how you reduce your anxiety when there's big change announcements. And a lot of times this is the real logic that's tethered to mindfulness practice. But if you just go to yoga and then you go back to your desk and you can't draw the lines, because sometimes they're not intuitive is what I'm saying. So we all have to be more careful about having conversations about what is a mindfulness practice? Why is it popping up in business more often? What is it actually meant to impact? And I think that's where there's a lot more communication that could be done, a lot more strengthening. But I'm not trying to sound combative. I think it's a great thing to do, but I think everyone there could definitely be a lot more linkage or application that we need to be thinking through when you're practicing.
Sam, I know for myself, I need to set aside time for meditation, and being mindful. And I know for you, Sam, though, you've kind of iterated beyond that. How do you manage to stay present? How do you manage to not let life be more like how do you not experience life as a roller coaster?
What an intense question to have to answer. I would love to answer it. I just think I want to start by saying it's a huge topic. Let me start with this. I think in the beginning of anything you practice, setting aside time to do it before it becomes natural, before it becomes something that is, it's like riding a bike. You know, you if you know that you're gonna, well, riding a bike not be the best example. Anything that you would have to practice to get it under your finger, so to speak, or make it habitual, or kind of your brain reorients to like working a new muscle or gaining a new skill, you need to set aside time to practice it because it's not intuitive. But is when you learn something, and then you can kind of just jump into the activity at any moment, and you kind of have a feel for it and what you're attempting to do and how you're doing it, then you don't need to set aside the time as much. So what I'm clumsily trying to say to start my answer is that the more I did where everyone does, where I started setting aside time and you start meditating, you start going and doing classes and groups and you do structured things, you're building a muscle. And then once you build that muscle, it becomes something you don't have to like put in the structure to remember how to flex that muscle over time.
Doesn't it also come from a certain amount of transparency and honesty with what you're feeling and processing in the moment?
That certainly is a part of it. I would say that for me, that's been more of a byproduct of practicing mindfulness than a direct, you know, I have to practice that as part of that same umbrella. But when we talk about this stuff, it's there's not a lot of standard containers. I think I'd like to spend a minute explaining more when you asked me when I said that muscle that I'm flexing. I need to be more specific there because what is the muscle? What does one actually learn? Like I said, if you think about riding a bike and you have to spend a lot of time learning how to ride a bike, but when the coordination clicks into your mind and then all of a sudden you get onto a bike and your body knows how to balance it and knows how the physics work and the mechanics and you can operate it, what is the analog to yogic practice or meditative practice? What am I actually talking about? What is anyone talking about? We're saying flex that muscle so that one could learn and internalize what that is. And that's the point of practice, right? To get better at it. Well, for me, the ability to understand what presence is what we're talking about. So the being fully present in the moment is you are not aware of a future or a past that can concern you in that moment. And that's what we're talking about in terms of change management and the ability to navigate change. So as an example, if somebody told you something was changing, you can only even process the word change because you're aware that you're in a state now that you will not be at a future state, and that you may have been in this state for a period of time. All of those linear orientations of time causes us to be anxious about change because we feel like we're losing something that we have now. When somebody says you're going to have to change your behavior, you're going to have to change your tools, or what have you. So presence is the absence of being afraid of anything that's time oriented, right? Or time bound, because you don't have a notion of future and you don't have a notion of past. So how could you possibly be afraid of something changing? And when you meditate, you're searching for that understanding in your mind and in your body. And I'll tell you, it could take hours of meditation to sometimes even achieve. This is how I would relate it in my own experience. Everyone might have different experiences. But to have one moment of actual presence and flexing that muscle where you lose your sense of time and you don't have a time orientation, I could spend months, and I did actually when I first started, spent months of frustrated meditation and structured practice. And you may only get a glimpse of what it means to actually be present and forget that you're bound in some sort of intellectual time construct. And then this goes back to, just to finish, sorry, the thought, when you get better at it and you start to know what that feels like in your body, and it's something you can't really put words to easily, then you can catch it. You can kind of flex it when you need to in between breaks at work, or just in breaths, or when you go to the bathroom and you decide not to use your phone when you're sitting on the toilet, or something as mundane as that, which is like you become aware when you're lost in time and when you're not. And I'll stop this small little I'm
Uh, I'll,
grasping.
I'll give another example of what Sam talking about investing what you imagine the future to be, or bringing your past into something. When the phone rings, I always see like three different kind of reactions that people have. Some people, when the phone rings, their first reaction is, "Oh crap, something bad," bad call from something at work or whatever. Some people are, "Oh, this is great. Maybe I won the lottery," and they're calling to let me know. And then there's some people, just the phone's ringing and they say, "Okay, should pick it up," and they just answer the phone. And I think presence is that last one, is just the phone's ringing, I'll pick it up. You're not imagining any outcome, and you're not leveraging experience of either bad calls that happened in the past or good calls that happened in the past. Although I would say that it's, I think, a helpful tool sometimes for a lot of people, especially when there's change coming up, is to imagine that the change will be good, and they'll look back on the moment when they thought something bad was happening, or something potentially bad could happen, and they realize that this was the best moment that ever happened to them, because this was the moment that it was decided that something good, happened as a result of whatever the change is. So I don't know if that was going along the same lines, Sam.
I think a good starting point is, everyone wants to just say meditation, or it's not that. A good starting point is actually a little bit more. I think a good starting point is responding to things. Let's say we're in the work context again, which I think is really important because a lot of us are in work all the time. Practicing mindfulness is being aware when you're injecting a lot of thought and it's preventing you from acting. So the example I was starting to flesh out was, if you get an email from somebody and you know how you'd want to respond, but instead you don't respond and you let it sit for several hours because you're nervous and you're thinking through the scenarios, or you're kind of thinking about how it's going to impact them or you, or you're concerned about the face value of it. It's that awareness in that moment, and saying that you can practice being more mindful by just being honest. And this is where Jonathan was saying earlier about what's the link within being more transparent and more honest. Well, transparency and honesty is just you being confident saying what you need to say and not injecting a bunch of unproductive thinking throughout it, because it's that thinking that's the absence of mindfulness. So I guess what I'm saying is, to practice being mindful, being honest and being transparent is actually, it is sort of part of that exercise. So if you want to make it simpler for yourself, practicing mindfulness at work is just practicing being more honest. And that means responding to things honestly and responding quickly, because you can also hopefully see in that narrative, you increase your productivity because you're not sitting on things as long, your turnaround time shortens, and generally you start becoming more responsive to reality, I suppose is the way I'd put it.
I think, I know for me, it was hard to be able to be present like that in the context of stimuli that were making me not be present. So work context, being aware and being present and in the moment, it was helpful to me to meditate and even if it was a minute a day or 5 minutes a day, that was helpful to practice. You were saying like work the muscle of the mind here. To get used to what it's like to not have so many thoughts in your head, because when you're always in your head, you don't notice that that's what you're always in your head. So being able to be an observer and be able to be aware of it, I think that's a hard transition for most people, and especially when something is like really stimulating them, a bad email or some upcoming change or whatever it is.
So let's merge the two together, because I agree, I might have been getting too fancy with it when I said meditation is not the way to go, because meditation is so ambiguous. Like, what is meditation? I mean, it's not like sitting in a cross-legged posture and having to have your eyes closed with a candlelit room, and having your Zen hands. Meditation can be, let's say, the combination of what Jonathan and I both said. Let's say you get an email that you're immediately anxious to respond to. Meditation in that moment is, instead of thinking about it, or instead of responding immediately, you just sit and you take several deep breaths and you try to clear your mind. That in itself is creating presence. And it's not, and this is where the subtlety of meditation is very difficult for beginners, because it's not that you're aggressively not thinking about the thing in front of you. It's you're not trying to do anything except focus on your breathing. And this is where at work, all of a sudden, even the context of you being at work melts away, and the context of responsibility of the day melts away, and it can just be lost in the idea that I can take a few simple deep breaths and be fully committed to those breaths. And that's flexing the muscle, that's expanding that meditative awareness, I'd say.
And the benefit of it, the real benefit of it all, is when you're in your head, as I was giving an example before, you're not aware of the impact to other people and what's going on. You're not aware of the reality of it. You're investing meaning in things people are doing or not doing, etc. And you don't have any opportunity to see an opportunity for yourself or where you could be adding value. And when you're the person who's just very present and neutral in terms of the activity going on, you're not the person with your hair on fire. You're not the person who's asking, what about me? How does this impact me? And, trying to get meetings to find that out. But you're the person who's just aware of everything that's going on and open to, asking a question and being engaged. That has a very attractive quality that is much more likely to position you for something good in the future than being the person who's just so in your head and so self-absorbed in what's going on. So there's a lot of benefit, and you attract very good energy when you're much more present.
I think the Great Resignation, well, there's a yes and no for this one, because I think actually is I think people are resigning in droves because they're being more mindful, actually, not because of a failure to being more mindful. But I think as mindfulness is increasing in people, they are realizing that, yes, they've constructed their lives in a way that's not tenable. So it's both. You see what I'm saying? It's not like it's actually an increase, I think, in mindfulness and generally social
Right. A
consciousness.
failure to be mindful leading up to
Yeah. Yeah, I
COVID
think
and the opportunity to be more mindful and reflect.
exactly. I think there's a lot of, I mean, for me, and this is a lot of the logic that underpins the business science too, the best outcomes of a process, and let's say now we're referring to the process of one's life, are by being present and maximizing your opportunities in every moment. The problem with that strategy for a lot of people and for conventional thinking is that you can't control the outcome over time. So, because you might be constantly changing, and that's a lot of the topic we're talking about, you might be constantly pivoting. Like you may be starting to work on something, and then in the present, some new great opportunity exposes itself. And a lot of people are trained to think, well, I'm not just going to be scattered and chase that, even though it's more exciting. I got to stay on my course. I got to chart the future that I planned in my 5-year plan or my 10-year plan or whatever it is. So people march forward. It's that way of thinking that lacks mindfulness. And it's how people kind of entrench themselves in positions that they built on a lot of decisions over and over that they not necessarily wanted to do. And then that's where you come to a point in time where, like you said, with COVID or the Great Resignation, where everyone realizes that all these things I've been building, it might have been years ago when I stopped actually wanting to build them. And now, once you have that realization, you can't keep moving forward. You can't keep cracking the whip on yourself to do things when you've seen a new way, or you've had a chance as a society to take a collective breath and realize this is not where I want to be. And a lot of people, I think, are just, yeah, they are becoming more mindful, and they realize they've got to rectify the lack of mindfulness that led them to the point that they are.
But the question, I really like the question because it's, if you weren't mindful in how you constructed your life, that idea of constructing your life, most people, most of their wake time is just distraction. They're distracted from being able to reflect because they're running between different things, and they're so busy all day long, and they don't have that moment to reflect. And then suddenly you don't have to commute to work, or you don't have to even get dressed, maybe just put on a shirt for your video calls or something, and you have all this extra time. Or I think for a lot of people also, they're home, and they're with their families, and with that aspect of life, or with nobody in their life. And so the home life and the work life, as we're always saying, is one and the same. Now it really is one and the same. And then you really start thinking about your life, and you start thinking about, like, are you doing the things you want to be doing, and the like. So it's amazing what can happen when, and you say this all the time, Sam, when you give yourself space, when you
I
have
was
space.
just about to say the
Oh, sorry,
space.
you
Yeah.
go with it,
No,
because
no, no. I'm glad to hear you say it. I wasn't trying to steal the
the
thunder from
student has
you.
become the master.
I was just going to comment though, the space thing is, when we talk about taking a breath in between things, and what you were just talking about, which is not being constantly busy, like the COVID thing did release a lot of time for people. And it's space that brings that insight. Space to me is such a huge part of mindfulness. When I first started practicing, because I know we're still on that vein of like, where do we start doing this kind of stuff? Creating space, I think, is extremely underemphasized. You don't even have to do anything with the space. It's just, if all of a sudden your lack of commuting opened up 3 hours a day for you, and your instinct was like, wow, this is a huge amount of time, and now I could fill it with other things. We're always trying to fill it, but really allow the space to exist. Space is really healthy for the mind and the body to process experience. We're constantly in a state of absorbing new experiences, filling our time with more experiences, even if it's just listening to music, being on Instagram, chatting with people, watching television. We have infinite stimulus, and you never give your body enough time to decompress and to process what you're feeling. If you're constantly emotionally engaged, or sorry, intellectually engaged, you can't feel what you're feeling at any given moment, because you can't do multiple things at one time. So creating space is another huge aspect, at least in my opinion, to mindfulness. And when everyone had more space forced upon them during COVID, I think it was a massive opportunity for everyone to process whether because like when you're commuting to work every day, as an example, you don't often have time to think, do I like commuting to work every day? Would my life be better if I wasn't doing this commute? You're just doing it. You're just doing things constantly. You're rushing to work, you're working, you're rushing home to take care of stuff before you rush back to work. But when people have space, they can interrogate, how am I feeling right now? Does this feel better? Does this feel worse? Do I want my life to be more this way or more that way? And that's the counter, again, it's the counterintuitive aspect of productivity. Like you said, Jonathan, I think, when you can do more and you're thinking or contemplating less, a lot of times, and this common theme of plan more and execute rapidly, it's like, just pause and create space. And when you feel ready to move on something, then you move, and you move with purpose, and you move with alignment of your passions and your interests. And then great things happen. And guess what? They happen quickly. They happen overnight. You don't need a 5-year plan. Think about doing something brilliant every day instead of planning 5 years to do a single thing brilliantly. You might not have cohesion, but you have done 500 brilliant things, or 5 years worth of brilliant things constantly. So it's a logic. It's a logic that you have to internalize. But let me pause there, because I know now I'm getting all jazzed up, and I could just go on that vein forever.
An interesting thing also about COVID, I almost think it's what it did is it created midlife crises for people that they might have
In their
had
early 20s.
exactly. They might have had much later on because, getting back to this idea of most of life being between things. So, there's going to be a merger or, and maybe I shouldn't have even started with, some change because this is just generally. But if you're worried about, okay, what do I need to do to get this next promotion? And so now all of life is oriented toward getting the promotion. Then you get that promotion. Then, okay, I need to get the next promotion. And then, you're always oriented toward the next thing. You don't really have a chance to think about or imagining, okay, what happens when I get it? And the studies show very clearly most people who are very, very goal oriented, when they achieve the goal, at that moment, that's when they're least happy. The least enjoyment comes from actually having it. It's always the struggle to get there. Now, imagine that you're orienting your life toward a goal that you actually don't even want. Now it's really even hard to get a lot of joy out of the struggle. So now with COVID comes along and you have time to reflect, you have that space. Suddenly you think like, wait, do I even like this job? Like forget about like, am I going to get ahead or whatever it is? Am I even happy here? Is this what I want to be doing? And so, yes, it definitely, created this high energy toward meaning, and reflection.
And just the sudden absence of normalizing toxic work behavior. I mean, I think for a lot of people, you just normalize if you have to go into the office every day and you have to do things every day and it becomes routine. I think a big thing like COVID and now we see in the Great Resignation is that you go home for a few weeks. It's like a vacation if you've never been home that long. And you think to yourself, I don't want to go back to the office. I don't want to subject myself to this kind of environment. And I think it's why would you? And I think that's our right. And the word, I think a lot of the what I would even start calling the old corporate paradigm. I think I could even say that confidently that COVID has permanently shifted business thinking for a lot of people and like how we think about business. But the old paradigm was we never wanted to give people a breath. We never wanted to give them a minute to think by themselves or outside of the corporate, hive, because then you could really start to think about what you're doing and you could realize that this can't possibly work for everyone in any given company. A single company culture can't possibly work for everyone in it. And like you have to force yourself into it every day and you have to normalize it so that it can be sustainable. And you have to then go to what you're talking about, Jonathan. It has to be toward a goal. It has to be toward a financial metric. It has to be chasing some endpoint to justify it. And it's just there's no argument for it. I would love to see the entire collective consciousness realize that there's no, like you said, it's unhappy. You're going to be unhappy if you just chase goals your whole life and you're not just living it out. I was a worse offender of that. So I'll tell you, for me personally, my entire 20s was just this. It was just setting aggressive goals for myself and just chasing them like a wild animal with that kind of abandon. And then when I tackled it to the ground and I finished, it was just like hollowness. And I know that's, people tell these stories, but you have to really look at yourself and say, what am I chasing? And it's not even when you ask yourself that question, if you can pick anything, you're already strayed because you shouldn't be chasing anything. You should just be doing what you want to do.
I think also COVID was so universal in dramatic impact that it shook people out of their normal thinking of what should I be doing? What should I be, at this age in my life, what should I have in my life? At this age, what should I have, et cetera. The should kind of went out the door and it gave a chance for people to think about themselves, not the person that they think they should be, but the actual person that they are. And that is where you really unleash value. Because if,
Yeah.
if you're always trying to be like someone else, you never get to be the unique, amazing thing that you could be. So
It's
I think
also it's also breaking, like you just mentioned, it's breaking the tracks that have been so entrenched for career success that people always use as benchmarks. Because I think a lot of not being present, for instance, is benchmarking and comparing yourself to other people. And like Jonathan was just saying, where should I be at 25? Where should I be at 30? Like if I'm at a company this long, should I have this many promotions? Should I have this many salary increases? COVID, remote work, like gig economy, all these things are kind of starting to shake a little bit. And COVID really was just like a big hammer to the whole structure because now it allows you to be more present when you wake up every day and you're not like, well, is my colleague who's been doing a similar job for 3 years, where is he at? Where should I be at? Like, there's so much more flexibility and fluidity now. You're losing your milestones or your comparable benchmarks against other people. And that's a good thing, because you don't want to live your life, like Jonathan said, comparing yourself to others or comparing yourself to some conventional or parental, a lot of the time, parental vision of success. Like, what did your parents think would be successful? What do your friends or colleagues think? It's all meaningless. And the more you can start to practice not comparing yourself and not kind of qualifying yourself as in comparison to other people's perceived success, you're untethered to become something unique. I think if you can't have that mindset, you're never going to express your uniqueness.
And, as someone who's been in the corporate world, very, like, I think a model citizen, from the outside, I could say when I first practiced mindfulness and a lot of these ideas, at first you become very self-conscious because you think, oh, like there's even a way I should be communicating, and I shouldn't be communicating about these kind of things. And, I'll be looked at as different within the corporate world. But what I found is people were hungry for it. People actually, they said, oh, wow, he's human, and more approachable and more interesting, frankly. So these are pretty universal, and you don't need to be not in the corporate world or, sitting on a mountaintop somewhere for this to be relevant. It's actually, again, it enables you to engage with people in a much more authentic way, and people always react to that. Customers, leadership, everybody. So this is not impractical at all for, from the business context.
Agreed. And I have that total same story. I think the transition is always the hardest. But when you start to get over the hump of being more honest and being more open and chasing what you want and being more authentic, you do get better outcomes. And we can talk about that's honestly a lot of what the business science is based on. It's the underlying logic of what we're talking about that produces consistently better outcomes. And that's a lot of what we're trying to get out in the world through this podcast, through everything that we do. But I will say the transition is very counterintuitive, because it starts to make you, because I was a shark, when I first started my career, I could do all the corporate things as hard as anyone else. And when you start being more mindful, you get up and all of a sudden you're the person who's like, why are we doing this? This doesn't feel right. Like, what's the purpose? And you're looked at as less aggressive, like you've lost your drive. You get very much like side eyes from people, and it's almost like it's that piece that's very hard for people, is what I'm trying to put my finger on for you, which is that when you start doing this, you may appear lackluster and like you've lost all your forward momentum, or that you're not as aggressive and you don't care about your career and all these things. But that's the irony. You have to have either faith or just practice, or you have to think through the logic of it. But if you actually start to convert over to a different way of thinking, you will be more productive. You will be more successful. It just may not be the way that you think. And that's hard for people to get through.
You might even come across as even more aggressive or more assertive, because if you're the person in the meeting saying, why are we even meeting? Like, because instead of just being like, okay, I'll find the reason why I'm here or whatever, but you're mindful and you're realizing we're not accomplishing anything, and you just put your hands up and say, okay, we're not accomplishing anything here. That's actually assertive, but it's authentic, and definitely would lead to a better outcome.
Well, I agree with that. I think if people are, and you shouldn't be chasing like the ultimate end goal of mindfulness from like listening to us talk about it, but it will end up making you more assertive and more confident. I mean, it's like basically the difference between, having a big stick versus being a river. Like, the river is more malleable and definitely more powerful. It has just like a force behind it. You're going to be forceful, and you're going to be, you're going to be in your power, is like the term a lot of people use. But it's not going to be some contrived, like, I'm just aggressive because aggression is a tactic. Your perceived aggressiveness or confidence is going to be coming from a place of authenticity. And that is a place where it takes a while to get there. But when you do, it feels great. And like Jonathan said, you're just the kind of person that walks in a meeting and says, no, this meeting doesn't have to happen. And then everyone doesn't look at you like you're a cop out. They're like, he's right. Like, all of a sudden they can just feel the truth of it if you're coming from the right place. And that's a powerful thing.
And it's also a lot more sustainable. I mean, there's so many things about all these, CEOs or, very people that are at the top of their game who have imposter syndrome. They're always, nagged by this idea that they really aren't as competent as maybe they think they are, or whatever it is. And a lot of times it's because they spent so much time chasing something or trying to be something that they didn't get enough in touch with what they in fact are, and that leads to a dissonance. So I think if I had to just give one message, if you don't practice mindfulness, we open the podcast with a change. I think change, like COVID, really clarifies things, or compresses time, so it gives you the opportunity to really grow and think about things. So yeah.
Yeah, change is we'll start where we end where we started, I guess I'll say, which is, it's all one related topic. Even though we started it with an example of change as a driver of making people consider their behavior and be introspective and be ready for the change, it really all centers down to this mindfulness piece. And I think that, it's a very expansive topic. I think we've covered a decent amount of today, and hopefully we'll talk about it more in future episodes. So with that, have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.